Welcome to Manufacturing Talk Radio, the only show that takes a look at the obstacles and opportunities open to small to mid-sized enterprises that manufacture here in America. Brought to you by All Metals and Forge Group, with your hosts Tim Grady and Lou Wise.
Good afternoon, folks. It's Lou Weiss here, and Tim, are you with us? Well, folks, we're having technical difficulties. I'm not sure if we are on air at the moment. Bear with me one moment. We're having technical difficulties today, but it seems as though,
I'm on
Tim,
with you, Lou.
Yes, you are. Welcome aboard. Having a little technical difficulty today. And we are going to be having our monthly guest, Brad Holcomb, who's the committee chair of the Institute of Supply Management. We will be having Tony Nieves later on in the show, who's going to be giving us the non-manufacturing report for the month of December. And we are also going to be having Tim, if you can give us the intro for Jock O'Connell.
Sure, be glad to. Jock O'Connell is Beacon Economics International Trade Advisor and one of California's foremost authorities on world trade, global economic trends, and the internationalization of the Golden State's economy. Mr. O'Connell is also former staff advisor to the California Commission for Economic Development and member of the California Economic Strategy Panel's Technical Advisory Group. So we are going to welcome Jock to the show. Jock, you with us?
Yes, good to be with you.
Great. And Brad Holcomb is the committee chair for the Manufacturing Report on Business, who graciously joins us each month to share with us what's happening with the Manufacturing Report on Business. And around 10:30, we'll have Tony Nieves with the non-manufacturing report. Brad, how are you today?
I'm just fine. Thank you very much. And hello to everyone and Happy New Year.
Same to you, Brad. And I want to apologize to our listeners today that we had a 10-minute technical glitch with regards to the Internet, but we're alive and well, and every show we learn new lessons. So that said, Tim?
Brad, why don't we start to go into your report? We've asked Jock to join us on the show because he's on the ground in California and has been kind of watching the import and export situation with the ports. So we'll get some feedback from Jock in a couple of minutes, but I'd love to hear what's going on with the ISM report. Go ahead, Brad.
Very, very good. And hello to you, Jock. The PMI for December was 55.5, and I'm really happy to be able to talk about that because it's a nice, strong finish to a very, very good year, despite the fact that the PMI is down 3.2 percentage points from November. But at 55.5, that's still representative of a 4.1% increase in real GDP. So that's very, very meaningful. We're coming off some really strong highs. We hit 59 a couple of times, including in October. And then, as I said, down 3.2 percentage points. But not to worry, this is a solid report, and happy to discuss it in more detail.
Well, Brad, we're going to take an opportunity to do that. Go ahead and jump into any one of these sections you want to, and then we do want to talk about exports and imports with Jock when we get just a moment. Go ahead, Brad.
Very good. Let me give it a broad brush here. As we've discussed each month, there are 5 components that factor into the PMI, and those include new orders, production, employment, supplier deliveries, and inventories. New orders at 57.3, while down 8.7 off an incredible high of 66. is still a strong number. Production as well at 58.8, solid, even though down in terms of the growth rate by 5.6%. But then let's look at some that are as interesting as any. Employment up 1.9 percentage points to 56.8. And I think that's very meaningful because our manufacturers will only add to the employment ranks when they have a good outlook and anticipation of strong new orders over the coming months. So up 1.9 percentage points is a strong, sort of forward-looking indicator. Supplier deliveries, and I think that the Jock may have some comments about some of the factors playing in here. Supplier deliveries is slowing faster at 59.3, and that means that suppliers are just having a hard time keeping up for one reason or another, and I suspect that imports of raw materials is part of that story, although I can't tease it out in terms of a specific impact, but nevertheless, supplier deliveries is slowing faster. Now, inventories as well, undoubtedly impacted by the West Coast port situation, as well as other factors, down 6 percentage points, now contracting from growing last month down to 45.5, a rather low point, and it is one of the factors that brings down the PMI from where it's been. So those are the five that go directly into PMI. Then finishing up the other metrics that we follow, customer inventories of finished goods, too low, down 5.5 points to 44.5. That to me indicates some significant sell-through in the December holiday time frame and an appetite to restock shelves going forward. Prices, it's been a big story for the last couple of months, down another 6 percentage points on top of 9 percentage points last month, now to 38.5, decreasing faster, largely due to the oil situation that we all are aware of when we fill up at the gas pump. Backlog of orders growing. That's good news. Exports of finished goods at 52, while down 3 percentage points, still a positive export number now for 25 consecutive months. And then finally on our list, imports largely of raw materials, still solid at 55 percentage points, but down 1% from last month. And I'll just add that there are a number of comments that we're listing this month relative to the West Coast port situation impacting the incoming material situation. So there's a broad brush for you.
Oh, appreciate it, Brad. Jock, I'm sure Lou's got a question for you, but what is your read from an international trade perspective on what's happening at the West Coast ports?
Well, as you know, the International Longshore and Warehouse Workers Union has been working without a contract since July 1st. They've been in contract talks with the representatives of the steamship lines and the port terminal operators since May, and still have not reached a resolution of most of the major issues that are at dispute. The most recent development is that yesterday the Federal Mediation Service announced that it had been asked to get involved, and so there's a fair amount of excitement now out here in California that this might prompt a rather swift resolution of the dispute. Unfortunately, I don't share that impression. The Federal Mediation Service does have a fine track record in general, resolving in fairly expeditious fashion about 85 to 90% of the cases that it's been called in to help mediate. But it's also had some very conspicuous failures. We remember the inability of the Mediation Service to resolve the dispute between the NFL and the Football Players Union. Similarly, they were unable to resolve a dispute between the National Hockey League that led to a lockout and partial loss of games and revenue for that season about 2 years ago. And even when they were successful in negotiating an agreement between the NFL and its referees union, they were at the table with both sides for about 4 months before that was finally resolved. So simply by having the Federal Mediation Service enter the negotiations now is not a slam dunk guarantee that we're going to see labor harmony on the West Coast docks anytime soon. Now this will continue to affect manufacturers as well as retailers throughout the nation, particularly those who have come to rely upon components and raw materials that they're importing from sources in Asia coming through the West Coast port. Those have been delayed for at least several days, and in some cases apparently causing interruptions in manufacturing operations throughout the country.
Jock, let me ask you a question. We've been, Manufacturing Talk Radio has been talking about the port issue now for actually several months. It's only been really within the last 24 hours that it seems as though that mainstream news media has awakened and decided to get into the game. Why have they not been involved in this? Why is it that our daily news has been ignoring something that can drastically affect our country's economy? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think they've been spasmodic in addressing it. I in fact, was on NBC Nightly News about 5 or 6 weeks ago when they did a report on some of the congestion at the ports and how this was affecting importers and exporters. But it's been just that. The national press, the mainstream press has been spasmodic in its attention to this. I think in large part because the average consumer really hasn't been feeling an impact. Goods have been coming in. Importers, retailers, for example, took the precaution for the most part of expediting their orders and bringing goods into the country earlier than normal. So we saw surges in cargo throughout the summer, clearly goods that were earmarked for the Christmas holiday season. In one absolutely ludicrous case, I recall back at the end of July, walking into a store in Vacaville, California, in Northern California, and seeing that they were preparing to lay out their Halloween costumes. This was 3 months before Halloween. So a number of retailers in particular, and I imagine a lot of retailers, decided to hedge their bets and to order goods early so that they'd have something stockpiled against possible port closure or severe congestion that would interrupt their supply chains.
I think maybe part of that was because those folks are on the West Coast. We being on the East Coast, we really didn't hear a whole lot about this until recent 3 months ago. So it's been kind of off of the radar scope, and considering that 40% of our exports go through California and 30% of our imports, or I might have them backwards actually, goes through Say again?
It was the other way around, yes.
Yeah. I think that it's a significant story, and the fact that Washington, our Mr. President, has been basically ignoring this also, I feel has been disappointing at best. There, I said in Washington.
To the extent that I've seen coverage on the East Coast, it's been the anticipation that this will help ports up along the eastern seaboard and the Gulf Coast to secure more of the trans-Pacific trade that has been moving through West Coast ports, and particularly through the gigantic complex at the ports of LA and Long Beach in Southern California. Everyone up and down the eastern seaboard and the Gulf Coast are anticipating the opening of the new set of locks at Panama, which will enable very large vessels to transit the canal. And I think to the extent that I've been watching press coverage on the East Coast, it's been in the context of oh, whoopee, shippers are going to divert their cargoes away from West Coast ports, and we'll be the beneficiaries.
Do you feel as though that once importers and exporters start using the East Coast, that the California ports have a big doo-doo problem?
Well, I think it's problems up and down the coast. I mean, some of the more intractable labor issues have actually involved ports in the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, Tacoma, Port of Portland. L.A. Long Beach is an unusual case because it's so huge. The expectation is that, yes, they will lose some share of trans-Pacific cargo moving westbound toward the United States to the Panama Canal and through the canal to the east and Gulf Coast, but that it will be a case of what kinds of cargoes they'll lose. And generally speaking, the economics work out that high-value goods will continue to move through West Coast ports because they can be brought to market throughout the United States quicker than all-water shipments to the east or Gulf Coast.
That's true. That's true.
Brad, in your report last month, there was an inkling of comments from your respondents that there might be an issue. What were some of the comments in this report relating to West Coast issues?
Well, I highlighted 3 specific comments this month, and the comments have been growing in number and emphasis as well. And the first one from Fabricated Metal Products, near and dear to your heart, says the following: West Coast port issues have greatly impacted our incoming materials. We are air freighting many parts from Japan and Asia to support production while parts sit at the dock. The next one from the textile mills industry: West Coast ports are creating delays for imported goods. And then finally from machinery, which Jock alluded to in terms of high-value goods, the West Coast port slowdown is really affecting deliveries of our Asian purchases. And, of course, we talk about this on the various media outlets, in this case on Monday when we released our report to provide some sensitivity and emphasis as well.
So you had a chance to speak with the usual, for instance, I know you're on the Wall Street Journal report and the like, about this issue?
Yes. My day, like Tony's, my colleague, on our release date is full of calls to Wall Street media, including Wall Street Journal, as you mentioned, AP, Reuters, Market Watch, live radio broadcasts on Bloomberg, etc. So we try to get the news out there and try to educate our listeners as well.
Speaking about educating your listeners, you have a formula that you've told us about a couple of times, and on calculating, I think it's new orders and inventory. Could you give our listeners a little insight into that little golden nugget of yours?
Yeah, one of the sort of side metrics that I put together and use for my own awareness is new orders index minus the inventories index. And any time I see a differential of 5 or greater, that's really positive for me, because orders is leading inventories, so there's a need to refill inventories in order to fulfill new orders going forward. And this month it's at 11.8, so that's a very strong number. But again, the whole report is strong, despite the fact that you see some negative numbers in terms of change. We're still talking about significant growth, and at 55.5, that means December was considerably stronger than November, despite the fact that the rate of growth was slowed down a bit. And if you'll give me a moment, I'd like to talk about a longer-term trend as well that I've picked up as we put 2014 in the drawer. and that is to say that let's look at the average PMI from 2012 to 13 to 14. In 2012, the average PMI was 51.8. 2013, 53.9. That's up 2.1 percentage points for the average. And 2014, 55.8, up another 1.9 percentage points, 2014 over the previous year. So we have a very solid 3-year trend, and I'd like to look at annual trends, longer-term trends, as well as to month-to-month, and our semi-annuals as well, in order to really internalize and get your head around what's happening in manufacture, which is a pretty solid story for the U.S. economy.
Everything that we are hearing and reading recently as the old year closed and the new year has begun, seems that all the prognosticators and soothsayers and forecasters are saying that 2015 looks to be a strong year going forward, notwithstanding the port issue. And I know you hate when I do this to you, but how do you feel forecasting forward as to where this year is going in view of the last 3?
Well, with our fresh semi-annual report delivered to the media on December 9th, I don't feel so bad because I'm supported by a panel of 350 procurement professionals in their forecast for next year, and it is very, very strong. And the headline number in terms of our forecast is that revenues on average will increase 5.6 percentage points, and that is different and better than 3.6% that we closed off 2014. So 5.6%, exactly 2 full percentage points increase in revenues for next year. And, you know, other important metrics can be found on this full report on www.ism.ws as well. Again, it's a great forecast reflecting our anticipation of good growth in 2015.
Now, Brad, you presented that report with Tony Nieves, is that correct?
Yes. Tony and I collaborate on our 2 semi-annual reports. So it really covers the waterfront. It covers manufacturing, 18 industry sectors, and non-manufacturing, 18 industry sectors, to cover the full gamut of GNP.
We're going to take a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we're going to be joined by Tony Nieves, who is the committee chair for the non-manufacturing report on business, to hear what his report is expressing, particularly in those areas of import and export. So we'll be back in just a few moments with Manufacturing Talk Radio.
Manufacturing Talk Radio will be right back.
American Crane and Equipment Corporation in Douglasville, Pennsylvania is a leader in specialized cranes, hoists, and material handling equipment for industries including aerospace, nuclear, oil and gas, transit, construction, and waste handling. Call 877-877-6778 or visit AmericanCrane.com. That's AmericanCrane.com or 877-877-6778.
All Metals and Forge Group is an ISO 9001 AS and EN 9100 manufacturer of open die forgings and seamless rolled rings in alloy, carbon, stainless and tool steels, aluminum, copper, titanium, and nickel alloys. Visit us at steelforge.com or call 800-600-9290.
Welcome back to Manufacturing Talk Radio.
Welcome back, everyone, to Manufacturing Talk Radio. We are going to be joined here by Tony Nieves, as I mentioned before the break. Tony's a committee chair for the non-manufacturing report on business. Tony, how are you today?
Great, thank you.
Why don't you share with us, Tony, what your report is saying, and particularly Brad was kind enough to give us kind of a broad brushstroke of the entire report, and then touch on imports and exports a little bit to see where those are. And then we have Jock O'Connell on the show with us, who is a international trade advisor with Beacon Economics. I'd like to hear his response to what you're seeing in your report. Tony, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. When you look at the overall report on business for non-manufacturing, we see that the composite index, which came in at 56.2, it's down 3.1 percentage points. That's slightly off of the 12-month average, which was 56.3. And just for our listeners to keep in mind that the composite index is made up of the first four indexes: business activity, new orders, employment, and supplier deliveries, equally weighted at 25% each to come up with that composite index. And looking at those four indexes, business activity shows a significant drop, 7.2 percentage points to 57.2, down from a very strong 64.4 the month over month. New orders also down 58.9. Employment is holding fairly steady at 56. It's down 0.7 percentage points, and employment is a really indicative of this particular sector being labor intensive. But when you look at overall, we're seeing some moderation here. We still have strong growth month over month, and not to be overly optimistic, but as the baseline moves on a monthly basis, and we see we've had such strong momentum going into the last quarter of 2014, the question was always, how sustainable was that level of business activity, that strength in the non-manufacturing sector, and whether or not, even though we have seasonal adjustments in here, that this would hold that strength for that last month, taking into consideration holiday time. And keeping in mind that even though retail is strong as we look at the holiday season, some of the other businesses tend to wane a little bit. And an example of that would be, as you see engagements in the consulting arena and some of the other industries that make up the various industries that make up the non-manufacturing sector, whether it be professional, scientific, technical services, management of companies, anything like that. There's a little bit of pullback with that lull that we have around the holidays, which is always offset a bit in totality by the retail trade. Moving on, looking at some of the other indexes, supplier delivery still slowing, not at the same rate. Point of contention is inventories unchanged. This has a lot to do with that burn off of inventory for year-end, using existing inventories, trying to really control cash flow and really matching up with what the capacity is at that particular point in time. What's really notable is we see prices. First time we've had contraction in 62 months, over 5 years, and this is directly correlated to fuel prices, the cost of fuel-related products, petroleum-based products. We're seeing it at the gas pumps. We're definitely seeing it across the board. Has it transposed into lower prices overall? I don't see that's the total case yet, even though we did extrapolate for the commentary. One particular comment that came out of the transportation and warehousing arena, where reduced fuel prices will improve the cash position of the company. And I'll delve further into the export imports after I finish this commentary, but when you look at the backlog of orders also contracting for the first time in 7 months. And overall, again, I like to say that we see this report, even though it's come down a bit in the rate of growth month over month, it's still indicative of a strong position for the non-manufacturing sector at this point in time.
Now,
what
how
is
about, go ahead, Lou.
I was just going to ask regarding the oil pricing at the pumps. We're all located all over the country. Yesterday, we happened to notice that regular gas price at the pump had reached $1.91 a gallon. What is it out there in Texas and Atlanta and that you're seeing?
In Texas, I filled up at $1.79 the other day.
You lucky guy, you.
I'm paying $2.19 in Atlanta.
Well, you guys
we're
can
still
afford
over
it.
$2 here in Los Angeles, so we're still not at that rate where Brad's at.
$1.79. That's amazing.
Driving to Texas to fill your tank.
That's good.
Let
me jump in for just a second to build on something that Tony emphasized as well, and that is reduction in inventories for inventory control purposes at the end of the year and so on. In the case of manufacturing, I commented on some impact relative to the West Coast port slowdown and the difficulty in getting in some of our raw materials. But also we feature a comment that indicates that because of lower oil prices and the prospect of continuing or even dropping oil prices, some of our buyers are holding off on buying raw materials in anticipation of lower prices in raw materials which have an oil component or oil implications.
Interesting. Tony, what are you seeing in your imports and exports before we go to Jock to kind of get his feedback on that?
Well, one of the comments that came in from our respondents, and I heard previously what Brad had spoken about in regards to the West Coast ports. The delays at West Coast ports are requiring rerouting to East Coast facilities, and we've been through this before. Where I'm located in the Los Angeles area, between the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, and how back in 2002, where we saw an interruption of service was initially out of the gate, and then the rerouting kind of put some things in the arrears, but for the most part, we were able to withstand that interruption of service, the slowdown. It did lengthen the cycle time. And so, therefore, there was more cost associated with bringing in, the tangible goods, specifically, and I heard it mentioned by Brad as well, with the Asian products. We had furniture and fixtures and lighting and things of that nature that were delayed and had to be routed through other ports or air freighted in at additional cost, and then overland trucking was also factored into that. So it wasn't a huge interruption, but definitely it had a cost impact for sure. And
Jock,
so
I'm sorry, go ahead, Tony. You weren't.
I was going to say that the exports and imports, if you look at the indexes, they both came down the same at 3.5 percentage points. Imports was unchanged month over month. Exports still showing growth. I'm not sure how much of that is attributed to what's going on in the ports, and I don't have that kind of detail to really comment specifically on that.
Mm-hmm. Jock, in terms of Beacon Economics or yourself as an international trade advisor, seeing what's happening at the West Coast ports, are you advising any of your clients on how they should respond to this situation?
Well, for the time being, it's sort of sit tight and wait for your cargo to arrive. There's not a lot to do right now if you've had your merchandise hung up, except if you're in the position of, as has been noted, air freighting goods from the Far East to maintain your operations. Long term, though, there's an increasing amount of interest on the part of shippers, the beneficial cargo owners, to divert their cargoes more regularly to Gulf and East Coast ports, especially once the new set of locks at Panama open, probably sometime in 2016. I was down there a couple of months ago, and it seemed to me that the Panamanians' expectation that they'd have the new canal operating by the beginning by the end of this year is a little bit far-fetched. There's still a lot of earth to be moved. But even so, probably sometime in 2016, this new corridor for trade will open up, and it's likely to result in a significant diversion of cargoes moving across that have been moving through the West Coast ports and into the interior of the country and back into the East Coast. We'll see more of those being diverted on larger vessels that are able to transit the Panama Canal and go directly to eastern Gulf Coast ports. So that's a sentiment that we also saw back in 2002 when there was a lockout and the ports were closed for several days before President Bush invoked Taft-Hartley and sent them back to work. There's an elasticity to this. The initial assumption is that, well, we must be more prudent in our use of ports and import routes if we're dependent upon imported goods. And so a lot of shippers adopted what was called a 4 points or 4 corners strategy of diversifying their ports of entry. In time, that tends to fall back. There's a regression there back to what makes economic sense for the bottom line. So while it might be prudent not to rely too much upon one particular port complex or one coast, ultimately this goes to a calculation of what's it really costing us. And so we saw a lot of cargoes returning to the West Coast ports, and particularly to the ports of LA Long Beach, which, when they operate normally, are quite efficient in moving cargoes economically and expeditiously across the United States.
Jock, I have a question regarding Panama, being that you brought it up. I recently read a report that Panama is instituting a loyalty rewards pricing program for their clients. Is that having to do with the movement of cargo perhaps to the East Coast, as well as the fact that there's going to be a second canal in Nicaragua, I believe it is?
Yes. Well, we'll see about the canal in Nicaragua. That may be a political ploy rather than anything else. But in the short run, the Panamanians, the Panama Canal Authority just announced its the rates that it's going to be charging once it opens the new canal. And it appears, without really getting into the numbers, that there's not that much of a cost saving to be had. So I think that they, like airlines, they're resorting to a system where they're going to reward their frequent flyers. In this case, they're going to reward by giving volume discounts to shipping lines that bring more cargo through the port and make it work.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Through the canal, I'm sorry.
Jock, we're hearing that some of the companies who have distribution centers out west are looking at a strategic move to shift those to the east, at least east of the Mississippi, because if you draw a line from Dallas to Chicago, 2/3 of the population of the United States lives east of that line, which means 2/3 of the consumers live east of that line, and then bring their goods in through East Coast ports coming up through the Suez Canal. Mm-hmm. Are you hearing any of that from any of your clients or out there in the marketplace?
Well, there's certainly a lot of inland development associated with ports like Savannah and Charleston, Miami, to build up the what's basically the connective tissue that links the port to the markets in the counties or states behind them. Frequently, we get caught up in thinking about ports as independent entities, but ports are only successful to the extent that they have the rail and highway connections and the resources to process the containers and other commodities that are being moved through the ports. So we've seen a large amount of investment going into distribution centers, transloading facilities, and also public expenditures in upgrading roads and highways and bridges and tunnels that are linking the ports along the eastern Gulf Coast to the interior of the country more efficiently. Ultimately, it comes down to a question of how quickly do you want to get your goods to market? And even though you're able to move larger vessels through the Panama Canal, or certainly bring them all the way around through Suez and directly across the Atlantic, you're talking about having your goods sitting on ships for an extended period of time. And the secret of success of the ports of LA and Long Beach, for example, as well as ports in the Pacific Northwest, including those in Canada, is that they offer the opportunity to move containers coming from Asia bound for Chicago and points up and down the East Coast, more expeditiously and indeed more economically than by moving them through all water routes directly to East and Gulf Coast ports.
So you're expecting that the West Coast ports will still do all right, and I think they will, because the very largest container ships I don't think are going to fit in East Coast ports even with dredging. Is that about right?
Well, they're dredging to accommodate some fairly large vessels, but the shipping industry is moving more and more toward adopting these mega vessels, which the ones that currently are plying the waterways have a capacity of up to 18,000 TEUs, or 20-foot equivalent unit containers. There are ships on the drawing board that will increase that to 22,000. I'm not sure what the engineers, the naval architects say is the ultimate limit for building these ships, but the industry seems to be ordering more and more of them and retiring the smaller vessels, and that will have a substantial impact on the trade routes. So we may be looking more at a hub and spoke system for moving goods around, where these large vessels will move between a small number of megaports and then discharge their cargoes either intermodally to move across the country, or they'll move them onto smaller vessels to shuttle them to smaller ports.
Understood. We're going to take a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we'll get a wrap-up from Brad Holcomb on the manufacturing report on business, Tony Nieves on the non-manufacturing report on business, and Jock O'Connell on the international trade situation. So we'll be back shortly with Manufacturing Talk Radio.
Manufacturing Talk Radio will be right back.
All Metals and Forge Group manufactures open die forgings in blocks, hubs, shafts, flanges, cylinders, gear blanks, and custom forge shapes, including seamless rolled rings in alloy, carbon, stainless and tool steels, aluminum, nickel alloys, copper and titanium for parts and assemblies in aerospace, oil and gas exploration, defense, machinery, transportation, shipbuilding, energy and power, pulp and paper, and many other industries. Visit steelforge.com or call 800-600-9290.
Welcome back to Manufacturing Talk Radio.
Welcome back, everyone. And I want to take just a minute with you, Brad. Is there anything in your report that is unusual, or is this kind of pretty standard for this time of the year?
Well, I think it's. Let me just put it this way: it's a great way to finish off a very good year with the PMI at 55.5, again representative of a 4.1% GDP increase. All the supporting numbers are strong as well, in the mid to high 50s, with the only one of the major indexes, that being inventories, below 50 at 45.5, and we've talked about the reasons for that. So very, very pleased. It's really, and I think one of the Bloomberg reporters cast it very nicely. This is perhaps a more sustainable rate, and I think I heard Tony talk about that as well. Anytime you get into the really high 50s or 60, you have to wonder if that's sustainable. We like sustainable numbers. 55.5 certainly fits that description. It's a great way to finish off the year and start off the new year.
Tony, how about in your report? Was there anything that was not expected that showed up in the report, or is it, again, pretty standard for a report coming out at the end of the year?
Well, I think the only thing that was unexpected was how we saw the prices index drop down to 49.5. And again, really not all that big a surprise when you look at what we were talking about earlier with the prices of fuel, with the price of fuel at the pumps and everything else. But I echo Brad's sentiment as far as the finishing up the year with this report, and how the non-manufacturing sector was building momentum all through the year. We had a little bit of a dip going back about 4 or 5 months ago, and then the last quarter really showed some strength. We saw the moderation, as I mentioned earlier, for the month of December, and that I think the table is set for sustainable growth moving forward into 2015. Everything, I think the only concerns we see right now, and from what our respondents are telling us, is how the global markets might impact the U.S. And I think, but overall, right now, the non-manufacturing sector has some really good legs, some good strength, and is set up for continuing on this path of sustainable growth for 2015.
Well, no one asked me any particular questions as the manufacturer. But I like that number of 49.5 inventory. That means that there's a lot of pent-up purchasing in view of the fact that new orders are at 57 and change. It seems to me there's going to be a lot of purchase orders placed anytime soon. So that's my 2 cents to this, the numbers that we've all been talking about.
Worth at least a nickel.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. We for the folks who tuned in late to this show, I do want to mention that we did have a technical glitch, and however, we still have quite a few minutes left. We will be able to podcast on our website the entire show, even though some of you couldn't hear it. And you can hear it at about an hour and a half after showtime at mfgtalkradio.com for the entire broadcast. Tim?
Jock, I just want to talk about oil for a moment, because the oil price has been backing off considerably since July or August, and we're now down below $50 a barrel on kind of two veins. First of all, what will happen? I mean, is this good for the European economy, or is this not so good?
It's hard to say what's good for the European economy right now. The euro is currently trading under $1.20. Certainly, anything that would reduce the costs of manufacturing and transportation would be good for any economy, but the EU and the Eurozone in general has some very large fish to fry before they're out of this particular bout of malaise. They've been going back and forth into recessionary circumstances for some time. What's remarkable, I think, about some of the figures that Brad and Tony cited is how different we in the United States are and the direction we're heading from much of the rest of the global economy. We'll see tomorrow the trade figures for the month of November. It's likely to show that we'll see a contraction of U.S. exports to world markets that are very sluggish, and at the same time, exporters will be dealing with the consequences of a dollar that has surged in value substantially just within the last several months.
Also, I note that Russia's economy is, at least their budgets were built on the price of oil at $100 a barrel. Is there any, and I don't know how much oil we sell and how much natural gas we sell into Europe, but has there been any discussion that you've heard about increasing exports from the U.S. to Europe? I'm thinking particularly to Ukraine, which would be a little in Russia's face, for gas and oil going to that part of the world?
Well, it's a delivery problem with the Ukraine since it's stuck in the middle of the continent. In general, though, the U.S. government's been lightening up on regulations that have up until recently prohibited the export of crude oil from the United States. We've been dealing in some finished petroleum products out here on the West Coast. We've seen an increasing demand for refined petroleum products going to up and down the West Coast down to Latin America, to Chile, for example. So we're getting more into the mode of becoming an exporter of petroleum products, but for the most part, Our trade in petroleum products has not been focused that much upon Western Europe or Central Europe.
I think one of the comments I found interesting from Lou some weeks ago when he and I were just chatting casually, as a manufacturer, since it would take a lot of forgings to accomplish it, would be to build a pipeline from the U.S. over to Europe, and we could pipe over either oil or natural gas to sell to that part of the world. Just to kind of wrap up here, because we've got about 10 minutes left, Brad, anything else in your report that you'd like to share with our audience? And by the way, we, again, appreciate you being on the show every month to share that report. And we encourage our listeners to go to www.ism.ws to get a copy of that report and also the annual forecast that Brad and Tony recently did. Anything, Brad, else in that report that you want to go into before we move to Tony and kind of wrap up his?
Just to build on your thought, and we always want to invite your listeners to look at the full reports available on the website, again, both the manufacturing and non-manufacturing, as well as the very recent December 9th semi-annual report. They're loaded with information on your specific industry and industries overall. Again, I can't emphasize enough, we had a very good year and a great 3-year trend, which I've mentioned at about a 2% increase in the average PMI from 2012 to 13 to 14. We anticipate, a similar, positive momentum going into 2015 and anticipated result. So again, appreciate the time to talk about this and to answer questions. And again, invite everyone to look at the reports in detail. Lots of good information.
And Brad, I think there's more on the www.ism.ws website than just your report and Tony's report and the annual report. What other reports are there for the industry to look at?
Yes, the ISM organization, of course, is a membership organization for procurement and supply management professionals, and its purpose is to provide support and education and continuing education for our members, as well as related publications. Of course, Tony's report and mine are the highlights every month, but seriously, there's a Inside Supply Management publication which comes out every month. One can see that on current issues and opportunities and success stories from various sectors of both manufacturing and non-manufacturing. So those are available on the website, as well as historical information and data relative to what Tony and I talk about each month.
Thanks, Brad. I wanted to make sure that our listening audience understood that. And Tony, is there anything in your report that you would like to share with our listeners as we wrap up today's show?
Well, I think we've covered a good majority of what is reflective from the non-manufacturing report. I think that we really have to look at the fact that, and as I mentioned earlier on in the show, about how this baseline does move each month. So we're measuring change month over month. So even though we see the rate of growth, having a lower percentage to it, we can't look at it as just being a numeric value. It's more about what's that rate going forward each and every month as compared to the prior month. So if you're looking at, say, business activity at 64.4, which is a very, very strong rate, and Brad touched on this, about being in the high 50s is something that's more sustainable, and that is a strong rate of growth in its own right, and again, moving from where the 64.4 level was on the prior month. So overall, this is a very good report, and sometimes it gets twisted a little bit that we've had a little bit of easing or slowing, or it's not as strong and it's not as good. But I think, as I said, that the table is set now for everything to be put in place to have some good sustainable growth moving forward into 2015.
Jock, we need to have you give us your website information in case any of our listeners would like to look in further into your business activities. So if you can give our listeners your URL, I'd appreciate that.
Okay, it's pretty easy. It's www.jockoconnell, all one word, no apostrophe, .com.
And Jock, anything else you want to share with our listeners as we wrap up today's show about, you picked the topic, imports, exports, international trade, whatever you see as a kind of a hot button issue?
Well, I think we're going to see a contraction of exporting. Clearly, the fact that the dollar has become super strong again, combined with the fact that most of the world's economies are in the doldrums. They're not buying. The demand is shrunk. At the same time that our products have become more expensive for them to buy. So I think there's no way around the fact that we're looking at a period of declining U.S. export trade. The good news is that as the optimistic figures, the very positive figures that Brad and Tony cited suggest, we are, to a very large extent, an unusual extent, an economy that's isolated from what's going on in the rest of the world.
So
well,
do you believe
positive?
Do you believe, Jock, that the U.S. or North American buyers are a strong enough economy to withstand the downturn of other continents?
Well, that's a big question. The issue of income inequality, the fact that wages have not been rising tremendously or significantly in recent years, suggests that while the GDP figures, the overall economy figures that show that we're growing briskly, tells one story. The question is how resilient are the consumers that drive the U.S. economy? How much are they going to want to purchase, and how much are they going to import? So we'll see that going forward. But the good news, as far as that goes, is that while the strong dollar prices us out of a lot of overseas markets, it does give us an advantage at buying foreign goods.
And that's certainly an advantage. So you would expect, and I would expect, imports to grow. Is that right, John?
I would expect to see the trade deficit, the U.S. trade deficit, widen in the months to come as a result of a shrinking or at least a stagnant export trade combined with a new surge of importing as we take advantage of the fact that we can buy more foreign goods at cheaper prices.
And Lou, anything you'd like to share with our audience from the manufacturer's perspective as we wrap up today's show and roll out of 2014 into 2015?
We, as a manufacturer of forged products, we had ourselves a phenomenal year. We closed off the year with the highest backlog that we've ever had, and also a very strong sales revenues. And I look at that 49.5 number, and I'm drooling a bit, waiting for the purchase orders to start rolling in to fill the inventory coffers of our customers. So we're looking at a very favorable year ourselves, and the strong backlog, of course, will give us a very strong kickoff for 2015. I'm almost ready to start looking at 2016, but I know Brad's not going to share anything regarding that information at this point. So, gentlemen, we really appreciate your joining us today, and we're sorry about our technical glitch at the beginning of our show. We will be having the show on our website at mfgtalkradio.com in about an hour and a half, and you'll be able to hear the whole show. And we look forward to talking with you next week, Tim. And it's a wrap from New Jersey.
And that.
Thanks for joining us on Manufacturing Talk Radio. You can hear our next broadcast each Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at mfgtalkradio.com.
The clock is